This is the instructional video on how to deliver the Introduction to Data for Human Rights training. It's a half-day module, but can be extended to a full-day module. So we're going to start by asking the audience or the participants, what is data? And they might have some ideas. So ask them first before you start presenting this. The first thing that I normally say is that people think of data as numbers, something like a count of something or a measurement, for example, 72 households. People might also think of something a little bit more advanced where we take a whole bunch of measurements and counts and we do something like a statistic and average them or something. So this is 4.9 average household size, which is the average across a whole bunch of counts. And then we can take that further. We might try to visualize that data. So these are household sizes and the counts of households at the different household sizes visualized in a graph. But data is also quotes and other qualitative descriptive things. So quotes, for example, they stole every last thing is something that somebody might have told you in an interview. Or you might record a video and save it to YouTube, and that is also data. Data can also be photographs, photographic evidence of demolitions or forced evictions. And things like satellite imagery are also data. So this is showing forced evictions from a satellite image and then a demolition in a community. And finally, maps is another example of data, where this is showing areas and lines, points, all of which are spatial data. And so we've got quantitative data in the first three examples, qualitative data in the next three examples, and spatial data in the final two examples here. And these are kind of fancy words, but quantitative data is referring to things that we can quantify as counts or measurements. And quantitative data helps us to answer what questions. What is the size of households? Qualitative data is telling us about the quality of something. It's data that describes something, and it helps us to answer why questions. Why, I'm coming up with blank for all of a sudden, but like, why did something happen? Why were people being evicted? And spatial data can be mapped, which is pretty straightforward, and it helps us to answer where questions. So next we ask participants to think of examples of data that they already collect or that they wish to collect. And this screen is going to be blank. So if you're projecting against a whiteboard or a flip chart paper or something, you can actually have people discuss this in the room and write their answers in the white space below. Now we're going to introduce what are human rights. And simply put, human rights are moral standards of human behavior that are protected by law. Local law usually, and definitely international law. And when we say international law, we're referring to the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which say that rights are inherent to all human beings, regardless of race, sex, nationality, ethnicity, language, religion, or any other status. And this includes the right to life and liberty, freedom from slavery and torture, freedom of opinion and expression, the right to work and education, and many, many more. On the right, you're going to see a whole bunch of, you're going to see 30 articles that are part of this declaration. And these articles cover things about the right to property ownership, right to thought, freedom of expression, peaceful assembly, and so on. The link here, you can follow it to read all of these articles. I would really like to pull your attention to what's coming up here, Article 25, which says that everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of their person and family. So here are all 30 articles and recommend you go check it out. Now, what are human rights abuses and violations? This abuse means abuse is something that is done directly by authorities or another actor. So these would be things like forced evictions, police brutality. An example of other actors would be mob justice, where the public takes a brutal action and violates others' human rights. And maybe this is overlooked by authorities or not dealt with properly by authorities. But human rights violations are when a law is violated and a law has been put into place for a specific reason and then has been violated. And this might be encouraged by local authorities. So the next thing we're going to do is ask our participants to think of examples of human rights abuses and violations that they have witnessed or have heard about in their own community or city. And again, this is a blank space, which you can use when you are projecting on a whiteboard or flip chart paper. So now we're going to finally finish with how to use data for human rights. This is really a framework that links data and human rights. And before we get started, I often will mention that we can look inward toward the community with data, or we can look outward toward decision makers with data. And we're always starting with a problem, and we're always trying to get somewhere. So when we look inward toward the community, we're trying to measure existing resources and assets. We're trying to foster solidarity. We're trying to establish or reestablish that people have basic dignity around a shared identity about where they live and who they are. And when we look outward toward decision makers, we are trying to seek a specific solution. We are trying to change systems. We're trying to change laws. We're trying to change practices, so systems. We're trying to establish the right of everybody, including our communities, to the city. And we might be trying to acquire resources and more. So let's take a problem, a human rights violation, for example. We might want to have messages that are tailored to our community or to decision makers. And to get those messages, we need data that we massage and translate and refine and analyze into information. So now let's look at the arrows, because this is how we can use data for human rights. So we have a problem, we have a violation to human rights. The first thing we want to do is to collect data. And the act of collecting data can be used to mobilize communities. We can hire data collectors, we can present this data back to the community, but the act of collecting the data, the act of knocking on doors and conducting interviews, or just being present when we're collecting GPS points, this act of collecting data can help to raise awareness about the problem and start to bring the community together and really motivate people to think about doing something about the problem. So let's say we've collected the data, we've collected some statistics, some numbers, we've taken photos, for example. The next thing we need to do is to analyze that data or filter through that data. And the analysis process is helping us to discover something that the data is telling us, maybe we didn't really fully understand before, or it's helping us to document the problem. And so a lot of the modules that you'll find in the Data for Human Rights curriculum focus on this filtering and analysis process. That leads us to information. So information is what we get out of data. It's the story that data is telling us. And we might get a lot to this story. There's a lot of information that we might be getting. So now when we go looking inward to the community, or when we look outward to decision makers, we have to further take this, refine this information and pull out the key messages. These are evidence-based messages based on the data. And these messages are presented to community to inform them and to activate them. And we're going to use appropriate methods to communicate those messages. Correct visuals, the correct language, and the correct format, so that they can fully understand and they fully feel motivated or activated by those key messages. And likewise, when we communicate this information to decision makers, we're going to do it in an appropriate format that really speaks to them, that motivates them, so that we can negotiate effectively and we can influence people's behaviors and thoughts with this data. So this is a framework that we're going to come back to throughout the entire curriculum of Data for Human Rights, that takes us from a problem through data collection, analyzing that data to get our key messages that are targeting the specific stakeholders, looking inward toward the community, outward to decision makers. So now I want you to encourage participants to think about their own data and human rights issues that they have going on in their own communities, and how they might use their own data for human rights. Going back here, how might they take existing data and discover or document key issues and then translate those messages specifically to community or decision makers? So again, use the white space for this group discussion. Now, the last bit is introducing what is dataforhumanrights.net. Like, what is this whole entire curriculum that we have? Well, if you check out our website at this URL, you'll find half-day and full-day trainings under the training materials drop-down menu. For each of these, we have videos like this, slide decks like this, and handouts with all of this key information. Handouts are translated into multiple languages, and sometimes other supporting documents or activities. These are trainings designed by and for community data collectors, and they support learning progression from beginners all the way through advanced. So we have 17 introductory modules that don't require any prerequisites or previous learning or training, and that can be delivered directly to communities who are getting started with data for human rights. And as people advance, as communities advance, you might start introducing intermediate modules. We have 6 of those prepared, or even more advanced modules with 6 more prepared. And the idea is to support community activation and influencing of decision makers with modules that are about data applications to human rights, foundational skills, for example, in Google Docs or Google Sheets on basic skills that you'll need for quantifying data, doing qualitative data collection, spatial data collection, and finally, through media, through communicating this data and messages to your audiences. So this is the end of the main half-day lecture. And if you're doing a full-day training, then you would use the next few slides. So there's an optional exercise that will take you through the whole second half of the day. And you would use this for small group discussions. And in the small groups, after you've broken people into small groups, you want to provide them with some sticky notes and pens, because the first thing you're going to do is ask each person in the small group to write down 3 or more issues that affect the community, and write those on different sticky notes. Once everybody's written down their key issues, they're going to come together in their small groups, and they're going to cluster all of the things they wrote down, all of their ideas, into different themes. And then once they have these themes, they can start prioritizing 3 top issues. And then once they have these 3 top issues, they're going to identify a human rights abuse or a human rights violation that needs to be addressed in their community or communities if it's people from multiple areas. So that's the first part of the exercise, and it helps us to identify a problem, the what. Next, they're going to think about why, the messages that they want to send. So why is this the issue that they've decided on, or the human rights abuse that they've decided on? Why is this important? And what are some of the causes of this human rights abuse? Next, they're going to have a discussion about who in the community are key stakeholders and which decision makers are key stakeholders, and who can they work with and who can they engage in the process of addressing this human rights violation. Finally, they're going to start thinking about the data and information they would need to communicate to the community or to influence decision makers. How will these issues be addressed? What types of data would be needed? Is it quantitative statistics, qualitative photos, spatial maps? How would they go about collecting this data? And how would they transform this data into information and key messages for those particular stakeholders? So this will take them through the whole second half of the day. There's lots of things to discuss here. Once the small groups are done with these big conversations, you want to bring everyone back for the closing of the day and have the different groups think about, just present what they discussed in terms of the what, the why, the who, and the how. And we've given this blank space for you to take notes again to wrap up the entire day. So good luck delivering this training. Thanks.